Keep on time, and we will go about an hour, and then afterwards, if you want to visit with any of our panelists, please feel free to do so. But I'm Rex Nelson. I'm senior editor of the Arkansas Democrat-Gazette, and it is an absolute delight to be with my friends here on the Southern Arkansas University campus. My friend Trey Berry, who I have known since at least kindergarten, if not before. We grew up together. Dr. Berry, thank you for being here. Good to have our president here today. This is part of a series that I've had the honor of taking part in around the state. I'd like to thank tonight the Arkansas Humanities Council. Paul Austin, the immediate past director of the Humanities Council, is here today. He just retired a couple of weeks ago, but he's still going to do the rest of these events. And I did talk him out of wearing Bermuda shorts with dark socks, even though he's retired to tonight's event. That's how he wanted to attend, but I was successful in that. So, Paul, thank you for being here. This is part of the Federation of State Humanities Councils Democracy and Informed Citizen Project, which was funded by the Pulitzer Prize and the Mellon Foundation. So thanks to the Pulitzer Prize, that is as close as I'll ever get to a Pulitzer. So glad to be a part of this tonight. Delighted, and I'm going to stay out of the way as much as I can and just kind of guide the discussion, but delighted to have from this side over, Jim Reppert, Associate Professor of Mass Communication, Paul Babbitt, who is Associate Professor of Political Science, and Mike McNeill, who I've known through the newspaper business since the late 70s, Mike?
Yes.
At least dating ourselves. Editor and publisher, of course, of the Magnolia Record. Let me just start with in the way of introduction. I mentioned that Dr. Berry and I grew up together. I grew up here in southwest Arkansas at Arkadelphia, and then grew up wanting to be a newspaper reporter. In fact, I collected newspapers as a child. I remember my dad would say, "Why don't you collect stamps or coins like other people that are easy to store?" My parents' attic was the biggest fire trap in South Arkansas because it had thousands of aging newspapers up there that I had collected through the years, and became sports editor of what was then the weekly newspaper in Arkadelphia, the Southern Standard, in high school, and then advanced to sports editor of what was the daily newspaper in Arkadelphia, the Daily Siftings Herald, all the way through college when I attended Ouachita. And then my first job out of college was at the Arkansas Democrat, when we had both the Democrat and a Gazette, as a sports writer. And I've gone full circle now. Paul's heard me say this, but I've been tempted in giving a little bit of background to start these events by saying, in 2017, I had my midlife crisis, and then my wife reminds me, well, if that was your midlife crisis, you're going to have to live to 116 because you're already 58. So, all right, I had an old life crisis, but I returned to the newspaper business, which many think is a failing business, but I love it so much I wanted to end my career there, and I returned to the Arkansas Democrat-Gazette after 21 years away. I had been gone for 21 years as a full-time employee, and am back now, and have frankly never been happier. But, one of the reasons I wanted to go back is because we do live in a challenging time for the news media, and also because, our publisher, Walter Hussman, is really trying to put out one of the last true statewide newspapers in America, as others have pulled back. But one of the reasons I think the Mellon Foundation and the Pulitzer Prize wanted to do these series around the country is there's a lot of confusion out there right now. I mean, we hear the terms news, fake news. What is real news? What is fake news? And we live in an era now. We were talking about this before we began the program. We live in an era now where everybody's a reporter, everybody's a writer, everybody is his or her own editor, because they carry these in their pocket, these phones in their pocket. And now it seems to me there is a lot of confusion on the part of consumers out there. Consumers are confused about what is real news, what is fake news, and there's a lot of doubt about what the future is of journalism, what the future is of the news media, which of course I think most of us, hopefully, in this room tonight will agree is essential to the future of American democracy. So with that opening, I'll shut up, and I know we've got some opening comments from all of our panelists. So Jim, let me start with you.
Rex, thanks for taking the opportunity to be our moderator this evening, and of course, welcome to all of you, and for those of you who are watching via the Southern Arkansas University Facebook page on live stream, whether it be live or on tape delay, thanks for being with us this evening. As Rex indicated at the outset, it's obvious that a free press is the cornerstone of our democracy. Yet at the same time, I also think it has to be safeguarded. And with that in mind, I wanted to begin with a quote. This is from someone who is a two-time Pulitzer Prize winner and someone who also received the Presidential Medal of Freedom. And this individual is talking about demagoguery. And here's his quote. Now, men who have lost their grip upon the relevant facts of their environment are the inevitable victims of agitation and propaganda. The quack, the charlatan, the jingo, and the terrorist can flourish only where the audience is deprived of independent access to information. But where all the news comes at second hand, where all the testimony is uncertain, men cease to respond to truths and respond simply to opinions. The whole reference of thought comes to be what somebody asserts, not what actually is. That's from a Pulitzer Prize winner, Walter Lippmann, who wrote it in 1919. The idea of fake news is nothing new. We can trace it back, at least in Great Britain, to the 17th century with the introduction of the coffee houses, which are also called drinking salons, and they were known as forums for political dissent. So much so that in 1672, Charles II issued a proclamation to, quote, restrain the spreading of false news. Sound familiar? Now, in my case, having gone to school in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, unfortunately, I'm in the AARP demographic. Look around, you may be alongside me. But in my case, having gone to school at those times, the way that information was disseminated was primarily one way: radio, television, newspapers, magazines. There was very little opportunity for interactivity unless you got some type of right of reply time from the Federal Communications Commission for radio or television, or maybe you were writing a letter to the editor. But of course, in today's life, as Rex indicated at the outset, everything is coming over you in the 21st century over the digital transom. And I wanted to give a statistic along that line. 7,500 news sites are responsible for 98% of the news and information consumed and shared online in the United States. This is from a relatively new media watchdog site called NewsGuard that looks at the general reliability of the sites themselves. So if there are fewer gatekeepers in social media, how are we going to discern, in terms of media literacy, fact from fiction? How are we going to determine propaganda from spin? Who's going to cry fake news the most? And what is their agenda? And who, for those of you who are here who are my students, you know that Repert terminology, who is working the refs for positive and widespread media coverage? And what is their agenda? Are they attempting to delegitimize journalists or news coverage and reporting? And for those critics, oftentimes, what is their alternative in terms of news and information? Information from radio, from television, from websites, partisan outlets that to a great degree only affirm their confirmation bias. And that leads us, of course, to media literacy, and I'm sure we'll be talking about that, among other things, this evening, because that's going to assist in determining what legitimate journalism is. So we can determine what is legitimate and what is not, from trolls, from bots, certainly the Russian propaganda bots, and otherwise, the naysayers, the deniers, the conspiracy theorists that propagate a false narrative and an alternative reality. I wanted to take a moment to quote that great American sage before I go any further. George Costanza. If you're a fan of Seinfeld, you remember that classic episode where he says, Jerry, it's not a lie, if you believe it. So, whenever you see something in social media on your timeline that doesn't necessarily pass the smell test, take a second, a third, and a fourth look. Possibly look at international perspectives on the news, but don't just take anything at face value. Look at a traditional journalistic news source. Look at those traditional journalistic news source social media websites or social media imprints to see whether or not what you're getting is fake, whether it has grains of truth, or whether it's something that you just can't believe. Because to be an informed citizen in this democracy, you have to take the extra step and read everything. Because in this particular case, there will be a lot of information that is at variance with reality. Take nothing for granted, because I think if you are an informed citizen, that can only make the democracy that much stronger.
Thank you. Paul,
okay.
Opening comments?
Sure. My comments are not, well, I didn't prepare much of anything.
It wasn't required. I'm going to make this as informal as I can.
People, they show up next to me with notes and note cards and quotes and things, and I'm like, oh, no. But I won't let that stop me. I'd like to sort of play a little bit on the last thing that you said. Can you just sort of repeat that for a second?
Informed citizenry?
Yeah, so the question here that I have, and one of the questions that I spend a lot of time thinking about, is what is an informed citizen? What do we really need to know to perform our function as citizen? Now, to answer that question, we have to think about what do citizens do, right? And they vote. Now, it turns out, depending on how you understand it, that voting correctly and isn't very hard. Now, by voting correctly, what do we mean? We mean, do you choose the candidate whose views or positions align most closely with your own? And it turns out that's really easy. It doesn't require much reading at all. Indeed, if you find yourself on the conservative side of things, in general, not all the time, not 100%, it's not perfect, but it's going to save you a lot of time. All you need to do is vote Republican. If you find yourself on the more liberal side of things, all you need to do is vote Democrat. And that's it. You don't need to watch any television, you don't need to read any newspapers or do anything else. But I think an informed citizen can do better than that. Now, one of the other things I also wanted to comment on is that mostly you talked about reading. And I was glad for that, because that means I don't have to spend all of my time here saying that watching television news is mostly a waste of time. Now,
agreed, but I'm an elitist print journalist.
Well, I don't. Well, I am an elitist, but I teach political science. I pay a lot of attention to what's going on, and I almost never watch television news. In fact, the only thing I watch on television that is all connected to the news, and it's actually an excellent show, and I think I can't recommend it highly enough, is the Samantha Bee show. I think she actually does an excellent job. It's supposed to be a comedy show, but she actually does an excellent job of reporting, and actually reporting on stories that you won't see anywhere else, in some depth and with a lot of seriousness, even though it is a comedy show. The last time I watched CNN or Fox News, and so this'll, I remember specifically why. It was the final vote on whether or not the Republicans were going to be able to repeal the Affordable Care Act, and since it was a breaking story, I thought it would be, okay, I can keep up more quickly if I have the news on while I'm, on my phone following various, well, I don't do the Twitter thing either, but following various feeds and so forth, and keeping up with everything that way. But they do such a bad job, right? And so the television news can do that, right? They can keep you up to date with something that's breaking now, right? Breaking news, but they do such a bad job of explaining what's at stake. What really matters here? Why should we care about this? What's going to happen if this side prevails versus that side? And so this takes me back to the notion of what does an informed citizen need to know? And do the media provide that information? Now, it's out there, and you can find it, but you have to know your way around all of these various sources. And you have to know what their agenda is, right? Most people who put things out there have an agenda, right? They have, sometimes it's explicit, One of the websites I look at pretty frequently is Red State. It's not as good as it used to be. Never mind that. But I know that when I read something on Red State, it's coming from a conservative perspective. And so I can understand it in that way. I get most of my basic news information from two magazines that I subscribe to, and that's going to bring me to my second point. I'm hoping I'm not going to steal Mike McNeill's thunder on this, which is the economic side of things, which are The Guardian Weekly and The Economist. And those are both, interestingly enough, based in Great Britain, although they do a fantastic job of reporting on things in the United States. I pay for an internet subscription to the Washington Post, though I don't look at, I'm paying for it, I should look at it more. I hate wasting money like that. But the paying for it is an interesting phenomena as well, right? So back in the old days, when I was on my high school newspaper, and that was my last experience as an actual journalist, we were a good high school newspaper, though. We won a prize. We got our information, we would pay for the newspaper. Now, it didn't cost a whole lot. I think, you know, a typical daily newspaper, this is back in the 80s, would cost 25 cents. If you were going to be fancy and read the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal, maybe 50 cents or 75 cents. But every day, from about the time I was in high school, 11th grade or so, maybe even a little bit before that, I would buy the newspaper. And when I was in graduate school, I'd buy two newspapers. I got one of the other surviving statewide newspapers is the Star Ledger, the Newark Star Ledger, which is, although the people in South Jersey say they don't pay enough attention to us, we'll read the Courier Post, but that's a whole other interesting New Jersey debate. People don't want to pay for newspapers anymore. People don't pay for subscriptions. They'll take what's free. And the problem is things that are free, no offense, often are worth what you pay for it. Right? That if you're not willing to pay for good information, you're just going to be left with whatever I mean, this whole Facebook debate, I think, is related to this, right? The idea that if you're getting it for free, you're the product. Facebook sells your information. Facebook is a very profitable company. Well, I don't know if it's profitable, but stock price is very high. It's a very valuable company. They're valuable because they're selling your information. And if you're surprised to find out that Facebook was selling your information, then you're really not paying attention to how the capitalist system works. Facebook and Google are selling your information. They're going to continue to sell their information because without being able to sell your information, they don't exist as businesses. And the same thing goes with all of these various free internet sources, right? They are selling something. If you're not paying for it, somebody else is paying for it. And that change in dynamic, right? The change in who pays for it, I think, is a serious issue that has deteriorated, I think, our media environment considerably in the last, I thought the Walter Lippmann quote was funny. And I'll just conclude on that. I recently finished reading Hamilton. And one of the things about Hamilton that that Chernow points out is that in the golden era of American politics, right, the 1780s, when they passed and ratified the Constitution, and George Washington was president, followed by John Adams, who maybe wasn't such a great president, and all the founding fathers, our press was more partisan, more misleading than it even is today. So all is not lost. The country managed quite well with with what we would consider today by a particularly terrible press, and I think the Republic can continue to survive as we work our way through this new information environment.
Mike McNeill.
Well, first of all, Rex and I have known each other a long time, probably too long. He was in Arkadelphia when I was at the Malvern Daily Record for about 7 years, so I know a lot of people in Malvern, Arkadelphia, that environment. Paul, you said something that I'm glad you reminded me of, and that's, well, two things. First of all, I'm shocked to find that there is a capitalism motive in journalism. Gosh, who would have thought? But also you were reminding us about the partisan nature of the press in the 17 and 1800s. The idea that newspapers were supposed to present both sides of a story is a relatively recent innovation. It really didn't come about until the late 1890s, the early part of the last century, when journalism schools were created. And the thought that you should bring balance into a news story. That was unheard of among journalists of Washington's era, Hamilton's era. All the media that existed at the time was partisan. That was the whole idea for them being, to support their party, to support their candidate. And the thought that we should have a balanced media, as I said, is a relatively recent historical innovation. I think it's an improvement, but it is more recent than people would give it credit for being. I was going to start about talking about something different, but I think I want to start with this and talk a little bit about fake news and the implications of fake news. I monitor a lot of Twitter accounts, a couple of hundred Twitter accounts, mostly news sites from all over the world. And on Sunday night, Monday morning, if you're bent that way and you were reading Twitter at that hour of the morning, you would have seen dozens of news sites, or I shouldn't call them news sites, Twitter accounts that were saying that the United States had launched a cruise missile attack against Syria. Well, that wasn't true. There were a lot of people saying that. There were a lot of people retweeting that. And in fact, it's 3 a.m. in Damascus right now, so it may in fact be happening at this very moment as we speak. But at the time, it wasn't. There were responsible parties on Twitter who were trying to tamp down these reports, were saying, people are reporting that there are American cruise missiles hitting Syria at the moment, but we really don't think that that's true. In an age when people could say almost anything and have the information posted around the world in real time, the stakes are too high. It's not hard to see how a nation state or a group could pre-manufacture a series of posts, news stories, and videos to make something appear to be real when it's not. The result can and may well become incidents that lead to hundreds of thousands of deaths, maybe even millions of deaths, because somebody printed a rumor or published a rumor on Twitter. It is not too far-fetched to believe that that could happen. We must remain vigilant. So what's the harm in posting some silly rumor on Facebook about the mayor of your town? Well, I like to think that you play like you practice. If you could do something like that and get away with it, and you're not called on it, what's to stop you from posting that the local bank is about to be seized by the FDIC? What's to stop you from posting untruthful information that your local groundwater is contaminated with lead? Fake news is dangerous. Fake posts are dangerous. Making ridiculous speculations and accusations about people on Facebook or on Twitter is dangerous. Frankly, Rex, I'm surprised that our legal system hasn't collapsed under a weight of libel suits that people could be filing daily against what their friends are saying about them on Facebook, much less their estranged family members or their ex-employees or employers. Jennifer McHenry is sitting out there. She's an attorney in town, and I'm surprised there just aren't people lined out the door filing lawsuits every day against local media sites and against people for Facebook posts for posting information that is obviously false and demonstrably untrue.
Earlier this year, I had the honor of being asked to give what was known as the Fred Dara endowed lecture for the Central Arkansas Library System in Little Rock, and the reason I was asked is because they wanted it on this subject of news and fake news, and I decided to simplify the topic, so I boiled it down to basically two things. I said, number one was, it's not us, it's you, and number two was chill out, and I'll get to both of those, but I'll start with the first one. It's not us, it's you, kind of the reverse of the old Dear John letter, you know. It's not you, it's me. It's not us, it's you. Us being journalists. About 2 o'clock this afternoon, I walked out of the newsroom on the third floor of the Arkansas Democrat-Gazette headquarters at Capitol and Scott Streets in downtown Little Rock to drive down here, and there were dozens of good journalists, most of them younger than I am these days, Mike, but dozens of good editors, writers, reporters, not as many as there used to be with the shrinking of the newspaper business, but still a lot of people, a lot of talented people, working to put out tomorrow's Arkansas Democrat-Gazette. And I can tell you there are still thousands upon thousands of talented, reliable, hardworking journalists around this country. And so in saying it's not us, it's you, I think what I'm saying is that I think the news consumers have some responsibility in this. It seems to me that in this country now, and this is a fairly recent phenomenon. We mentioned that, you know, the media has always a long history in America of taking one political side or another. But one of the things that seems new to me is that we've got this whole class, and again, I use the term political hobbyists, because I want to think these are people that at one point on a nice April day like this would have been out working in their garden or working in their flower bed. That was their idea of entertainment in the afternoon. Now a lot of these people are watching hour upon hour of cable news. Not to be informed, but to be entertained. It is their form of entertainment. That's why we don't see straight news on the cable stations in prime time. We see what I consider more entertainment shows than we do straight news shows.
Certainly
they argue
see an
with each
alternate
other.
reality, that's for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I worked for a time at the Arkansas Democrat-Gazette with Tucker Carlson. I'd tell my friend Tucker, you do more of an entertainment show than you do a news show now. So it's not us, it's you. You've got these hobbyists who, it seems to me, see everything, including where to go to buy their donut in the morning, through a partisan political lens. And their blood pressure seems, the ones I talk to or hear from, perpetually elevated. Do consumers not have some responsibility? I know it's nothing the media can force. All we can do is do our best job of reporting and editing. But I'll start. We'll go back down this end again, Jim. But should there not be some responsibility on the part of the American news consumer here?
Oh, absolutely. This is all about eyeballs. It's very tough for me to say the term Fox News Channel because so much of it is not news. A lot of it, as you mentioned, it's op-ed,
It's entertainment,
which is fine. When you've got propaganda theories and all different kinds of nonsense that's taking place in the prime time hours because they're trying to keep the average 66-year-old white male, the Fox News viewer, aggrieved. And whenever you see some of the other stuff in the daytime, when you see legitimate news reporters on Fox, such as Ed Henry, or you see someone such as Shepard Smith, they are basically out in the wilderness. I always joked that whenever I watched any of these programs, I always noticed what I called in my classes situational hypocrisy from the point of politicians, where if Barack Obama is president, a Republican might have one view of the issue. When Donald Trump is president, they've taken the other side. And that's why I always enjoyed having someone like Jon Stewart on The Daily Show basically serve as an unintentional ombudsman, taking a look at all of these video clips, watching these people wrap themselves into Gordian knots over all types of rhetorical daring-do. But I think it really all depends upon whether or not you're watching one channel or you're going back and forth. But you're right, there is a lot of entertainment value to the stuff on cable. and you're dealing with hundreds of thousands of viewers at one time. But there are a lot of people who get all of their news from that. The individuals that you talked about at the coffee shop in the morning are probably the same ones that say, well, I'm not going to go to Starbucks because they're obviously biased. Look at the designs that they put on their coffee cups at Christmas.
Right.
Well, I can't go there because they're obviously not going to celebrate Christmas the way that we do because they had the audacity to say happy holidays. So, especially with cable, there's a lot of stuff there which is good, but at the same time, you always have to take it not with a grain of salt, but with a shaker.
And not just cable, but what people are reading, especially on their phone, especially what they're reading online. Jim, I'll bounce it over to you. Paul, I'll bounce it over to you from the political science standpoint. What should be, if anything, the responsibility of the American news consumer?
Well, so let me just pick up on something that Jim mentioned in his opening remarks, and this is the idea of a confirmation bias, right? And so the confirmation bias basically says that we tend to take more seriously information that confirms what we already believe.
Absolutely.
And more than that, right, we tend to find information that contradicts our beliefs unpleasant and even painful. And this is clearly part of the economics of much of the news industry now, right? That they feed our confirmation bias. And so I think one thing that people can do without too much difficulty is once a day, find something and read it that you disagree with. Perhaps again, I think that's an important, and I don't want to engage in this sort of both-siderism, right? There is this idea out there that in order to be balanced, you need to present both sides of a story, but sometimes a side of a story really is nonsense. Vaccines don't cause autism, and anybody who posts something like that on my Facebook feed gets defriended. The other thing I've decided to do is if I see if I don't know how many people in here are Facebook friends, but I've started just to defriend people who post more than one obviously false story. Both sides means, right, that we consider the possibility that we might be wrong about certain things. Now, again, what counts as both sides, what we should consider, is not really as important as that we do from time to time, again, in my case, at least once a day, encounter something with which we disagree. And I think that might help a little.
Mike, talk about news consumers a little bit.
They consume a lot.
They do.
They are hungry beasts. They want to be fed around the clock. And as Paul notes, a lot of them want to be fed with what they agree with. They can't stand the broccoli. They don't want the Brussels sprouts. They have an aversion to mac and cheese. They only want what they want when they want it. I've often thought of readers as a bell curve. You've seen the bell curve. There's some people on this side that are really, really smart, and then that curve goes up, and most of the people are somewhere in the middle between being really smart and really dumb, and it goes down to the people who have the intelligence of algae. Unfortunately, I think some of the people who post on Facebook, there's kind of an opposite bell curve going on. You've got the really smart people on one end, or most of the people are on one end or the other, and they want to get involved or they don't want to get involved, and then you've got this great middle of people who are the algae who want to comment on things. That's perhaps overly harsh, but not that far off. I do have a Facebook page for our website, magnoliareporter.com, and we post several stories every day from our website onto the Facebook page. But I gotta tell you, I have sitting in my computer system something I have never posted, which is probably a multi-page policy that I'm going to implement for Facebook. of what I will and will not allow in terms of comments. And if you don't like it, you can go read some other Facebook page or start your own. You know, I've set this whole list of offenses that people engage upon. You know, calling other people names, deliberately picking fights with other folks. As I said, I have this huge list. And I swear there's not a day that goes by where I don't want to say, okay, this is going to be our policy from here on out about posting on Facebook. But, you know, then I chill and say, well, you know, perhaps that's not a good idea. You know, you just let people have their say. But again, you know, I come back, you know, to what degree do you allow a person to post on your Facebook page something that is so obviously crank, so obviously false? The Facebook readers I really love are the ones who post comments to stories when they obviously haven't bothered to read the story yet.
Absolutely. I deal with those every day.
Every day.
Comment on things they haven't read yet.
Yes, and I'm so tempted to say, well, just before you comment on this story, read the damn story, please. And but people will just react to the headlines. So that's a lot of the problem. People just simply react to headlines. They don't bother themselves with additional facts, additional context. It's maddening.
I sense that what we are seeing in the country as a whole is what we have seen in Congress now for a number of years, and that is the extremes pulling further and further away from each other. I lived in Washington, D.C. from 1986 through 89, lived on Capitol Hill and covered Congress for the Arkansas Democrat in those 4 years. And I kind of think that even then it was starting to change, but I was still at the end of the era where the old saying really was true. People could argue on the floor during the day and go to dinner at night. And just as a side note, you know, the other end of an era that was when congressmen and their families still actually lived in Washington. And I thought that was a good thing because they went to church with each other and their kids played Little League Baseball with each other and they had to deal with each other and got to know each other as individuals. And then we started expecting them to be home every weekend. And I think we lost something there. I had much rather my member of Congress, frankly, be getting to know his or her colleagues rather than riding in, say, the Stone County Fair Parade and feeling the need to do that on a Saturday. So I think we've lost something there. But I see that in the country as a whole, as people, again, this confirmation bias again, as they watch MSNBC over here, or they watch Fox News over here. And I guess I'll start this one with you, Paul, because you're the political science professor. But I mean, is the day of the American moderate, the day of the American pragmatist at an end?
So, yeah, I used to draw, when I taught Congress, I would draw this chart where it had two humps for representing the polarization of Congress, and then for the people, I drew a single hump, right, a normal curve, most people being in the middle. The data is revealing increased polarization, but really it's geographic now, right? I mean, what's interesting is that people have sort of moved to parts of the country where, and again, whether they've done this intentionally, you know, I'm a hippie liberal, I'm going to move to San Francisco, oh, I can't afford to live there. But, all right, so that's a whole other set of issues. So people have, and they found themselves in these bubbles, right? And I think that has begun to make this polarization that we see in the media, and particularly among politicians, also reflected in our population. But I don't think it would be all that difficult, right, to see, at least within the population, a return to that pragmatic center. Because I think most people really what do people want out of politics, right? I mean, mostly we want a safe town, we want a clean environment, we want decent jobs, we want to be able to provide for our children, and we want policies that, political scientists call these valence issues, right? The things that mom, apple pie, and I forget what the other, baseball. And I think those needs continue to be the strongest needs that the American people, and not just the American people, but people all over the world as human beings, feel. So what's changed is how are we going to get those things? And there we find ourselves increasingly looking at ideological answers rather than the pragmatic answers. To some extent, I think that some of the blame there can be laid at the feet of, well, political scientists, right? We like theories and we want to apply our theories all the time. We've lost a sense of, in the pluralism, I think, is one of the more important things that we can endorse from a political science perspective. But I think that pragmatic of what we want from our policymakers is not ideology, but solutions to problems, I think is important. And here's a little bit of sort of local evidence for that, right? Two of the most popular politicians in Arkansas, one Democrat and one Republican, Mike Beebe and Asa Hutchinson. Now, they disagree about a lot, right? They've governed the state in different ways. But primarily they're pragmatists, especially Beebe, but Hutchinson as a governor has been pretty pragmatic as well. And where are their popularity ratings? They're astronomically high.
Exactly.
That being a pragmatic problem solver is more important for having high approval ratings. I think when Beebe left office, his approval ratings, this is after 8 years, were in the 70s.
Highest in the country.
Highest in the country. Most popular elected
yeah.
official in the country. And Asa's popularity ratings are in the 60s, which is outstanding, probably among the highest in the country, I would think.
Yeah.
And so that's my evidence, right? We want governors, and I would say all of our politicians, to be focused on solving problems, not on implementing a particular ideology.
I'll just add to that because I just happened to speak on that subject yesterday in Fayetteville, is that one of the things after a whole series of natural and man-made disasters that kind of made up the history of our state, at least up through the 1960s, I happen to think we've had in this state a pretty good run of governors for a half century now, ever since Winthrop Rockefeller was elected in 1960, own both the Republican side and the Democratic side. Our executive branch, if you consider we're looking at a half century, 52 years actually, since the Rockefeller election now almost, has been pretty clean, pretty scandal-free, frankly. The scandals have tended to be in the legislative branch.
That's a whole other.
We've got a trial going on right now.
Yeah.
But that's where they've been. But the legislative branch, I think we've been fortunate, and I think that does come back to pragmatic governors. I left journalism. I worked for Mike Huckabee as his policy and communications director for 9 years, and then I knew Mike Beebe very well. I know Asa Hutchinson very well, and two of them Republicans, one Democrat, but they all governed from the middle, all popular, and governed quite a bit alike, frankly.
Yeah.
All three of them. But again, on the national stage, we tend to, it seems still, pull further and further apart. So, Jim, again, the future of the American moderate.
Find one. It's tough because whenever you see the moderates being interviewed, they're basically being whipsawed in the primaries. That's why it's very challenging to see any Republican go after the president before the primary season. It's really tough.
And those of us in the media really don't like quoting moderates, right? Because they're kind of boring.
Well, yeah. Remember,
is that a fair?
I'm old enough to remember when that was Al Gore's staple when he was running for president in 1988, right around the age of 40. He was claiming in the 1988 Democratic primaries that Michael Dukakis was too liberal. And the other thing you notice about him was he always talked about, and Tipper was always out there too, that was part of their political strategy, that he was a raging moderate. Mm-hmm. And you don't see the raging moderates anymore. And of course, Bill Clinton was part of the DLC, and you don't see that a lot anymore. So it'll be really interesting to see what happens in 2018, especially now that Paul Ryan is indicated that he's going to retire to spend more time with the family, and you'll notice that whether they're Republicans or Democrats, they always want to spend more time with the family when the electoral map does not look all that promising.
I had to think of this because I mentioned I spent 9 years in the governor's office. We had an internal joke there when we would have to let somebody go in state government that we had some forms in our news release, and one was A, I'm burned out, B, want to spend more time with my family, or C, to consider my future options. Those seem to be things we hear a lot. Mike, back over to you. Anybody left in the middle, or are we just pulling to the extremes in this country? As voters, as news consumers, as
I have
citizens.
to reveal my political bias. I think the moderates, the last presidential election, were Gary Johnson and Bill Weld. But the libertarians got 2% of the vote.
I was among those 2%. Yeah.
That's where my thinking comes from.
So, what we talked about the responsibility of the consumer. Let's go back to the media, Jim. What is the responsibility of the media? I think we tend to make it more complicated than it is. I think it's to give a accurate, most importantly, an accurate report of the day's news. And if you're doing opinion, and I'm now on opinion side after my previous career at the paper had been on the news side, I'm now on opinion side. If you're doing opinion, make sure it's reasoned opinion and backed up by facts.
It's basically meat and potato stuff. I mean, whenever you look at Magnolia Reporter, Magnolia Banner News, we're always looking at stuff that's not necessarily sexy. We're looking at roads, we're looking at water, we're looking at maintenance. In some cases, you're looking at oil leases. Well, only when we get to the national level on many occasions do we get into a lot of the partisanship. But when you're looking at local newspapers in particular, and I'm sure all of you will probably go to Magnolia Reporter tonight or look at some of the other state publications or those that are in the Arklatex, oftentimes we're just looking for basic day-to-day stuff. Maybe it's economic, maybe it's something that deals with lifestyle. But I know that's the way I consume my news, and I'm guessing most of you do the same thing. Not necessarily all that exciting, but then whenever we look now in sports or in news, oftentimes what happens are the hot takes, because that's what moves the merchandise. That's what sells
Looking
the
for clicks
advertising.
online.
And exactly, you're looking for clicks, and especially now in countries such as India, where YouTube has become very popular. More than 172 million people in India use YouTube, because now they have more inexpensive data plans on their personal devices. But there was a tweet that was sent out by an Indian who is an expert in examining his country's media. And on March 1st, every trending video on YouTube in India was fake. Every one of them.
Wow.
But the challenge is all of these fake videos were still drumming up AdSense dollars. And that's where we always have to determine what's real, what's not. But I think, like I said at the outset, I think for most of us, we're not necessarily looking at anything that is the really sexy stuff. It's the meat and potatoes materials that grab our attention.
All right, Paul, I want to hear it from the perspective of political science professor, responsibility of those of us in the media.
Okay, so one of the things I would say, and this again builds off of what Jim said, I think there's a big difference between presenting your opinion in a commentary type piece and a take or a hot take, right? And I think we've become confused with that. And so I think one thing that the media ought to do is stop using Twitter. They can read it, but they shouldn't be posting on it with the various hot takes. I also think the other issue that's really difficult, because it's not going to immediately attract eyeballs, is to really provide that technical analysis. One of the interesting issues that wasn't an issue in the 2016 campaign was the Trans-Pacific Partnership, because both Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump were opposed to it, right? They said, we're going to pull, and this was a deal that President Obama had negotiated with 11 other countries in the Pacific Rim, and it was attacked from both the left and the right for different reasons, and so we're pulling out of it. This is a terrible, terrible thing in my view, right? I think the Trans-Pacific Partnership was an absolutely necessary thing to help contain Chinese influence in the Pacific, and the fact that we pulled out of it has made all of us less safe, and it probably will, in the long run, harm our economy because it opens the door for more Chinese influence in the region. And it does nothing to protect, pulling out does nothing to protect American jobs or anything else, right? I think it's one of the things that you didn't ever hear was that the Trans-Pacific Partnership did not include China. Indeed, it was specifically intended to exclude China, right? And so that lack of information, right? The fact that no one said, you know, is it really a good idea that we all are excited about pulling out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership? What is it? What does it do? Why would we want to be in it in the first place if it's such a terrible idea that both Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump are opposed to it? Or, of course, you may have taken the other position. Well, both of them are opposed to it, then I'm going to be for it because I don't like either candidate. That might have been a response that some people had. But it's that kind of analysis that is missing even from our better newspapers. And again, I think it's missing largely because you get the take, right? The comment, you know, you sometimes will see on the internet a long series of commentary and analysis and then followed by the letters TLDR. Too long, didn't read. And so I understand, we need to read the long pieces. Mm-hmm. I get really frustrated. Sometimes I find myself clicking on something and I read it and it goes on for 4 or 5 paragraphs and then it ends and I'm like, they're not done yet. Yeah. It's almost like I'm reading a student paper and I read the first page and I'm like, where are the other 4? So I think we need to have a little bit longer attention span, and perhaps that's not just the fault of technology, but I think the hot take is one of the worst things that's happened, and we need to stop doing them and having them and putting them out on Twitter and Facebook.
I tend to agree with you. I don't tweet. I do Facebook because I can post full stories on there and clicks to them, but I don't tweet for that very reason. Mike would say just because I'm wordy and I've always written long. I tell people I can't write my name in 280 characters, you know. But Mike, you spent many decades with traditional newspapers and then successfully started an online site. But talk a little bit about media responsibility. We talked about the responsibility of the news consumer. What about the media?
Well, I think Paul's right. I think, and we see the evidence every day now where people do seem to be more willing to pay for news sites that offer greater analysis, greater depth to stories. Paul mentioned The Economist, which is a wonderful magazine.
Agreed.
To be British-based, but to have such a clear understanding of American political issues and economics. It is the responsibility of the news media to provide that context and provide that depth of understanding. But here's the problem. You know, let's bring it down to the local level. Let's talk a little bit about the recent election that we had in this city to perhaps build a new aquatic center and recreation center with ballparks, a $15 million issue. Goodness knows, Magnolia Reporter probably just dropped the ball entirely on providing enough analysis and depth about that issue to where people understood it and understood better what they were voting on. I suspect my counterparts over at the as we call in our business, the dead tree in town would agree if they're being honest about it. Because, and why is that? Well, Magnolia Reporter, you're looking at him. He's one guy. He's got other things to do during the course of the day. The Banner News is not in much better shape with the number of people that it has to devote to any one topic and the amount of time that it has to devote to any one topic. And it comes down to money. Neither one of us have sufficient revenue to hire the staff that we need, that we can spend and put on task, and to report local stories the way that they need to be done. Let me just cite something for you. You know, I am in the online world, and I'm a member of it, or my news site is a member of an organization called Lion, which is Local Independent Online News, which is about 250 independently owned news sites all around the country. And most of them are sites a lot like my own, but some of them are doing some incredible work in niche reporting. There is an online publication over in Tyler, Texas called Tyler Loop that is doing a form of journalism that we call small batch reporting, which is to say they don't do much of anything at all, but they cover 1 or 2 stories a month in Tyler incredibly well and in depth. And that's where they're making their bread and butter, by providing intense coverage of just a very few topics a month, instead of doing what I do, which is to try to cover a dozen different topics a day by myself. So, you know, that's where it comes down to where the rubber meets the road in Magnolia, Arkansas. We need to have the resources to do the type of reporting that we need to do on issues that affect people right here, and goodness knows we've got enough of them, from the state of the health of this community to our economic development to our educational system, you name it. We've got real issues in this city and in this area in South Arkansas that need to be addressed by really good journalism, and we need the funding for that type of work. One of the reasons the Democrat Gazette is held in such high regard is because it is the only statewide publication with some deep pockets to do the type of work that needs to be done in journalism in this state.
And that leads me, I'm going to quote real quickly from a story that ran in the New York Times back on January 25th. In April 2016, a few instances of nearby schools failing to report child abuse caught the attention of the investigations team at the Indianapolis Star. The journalists wondered how often it happened and why. As one of the reporters looked into it, a source tipped her off to a lawsuit accusing USA Gymnastics, which is based in Indianapolis, of the same behavior. Later that day, the Star put her on an airplane to Effingham County, Georgia, fearful that the records would soon be sealed. She returned with almost 1,000 pages of documents. She and 2 other reporters dug in. The decision of the newspaper to spend on airfare to follow a lead, then throw themselves behind an investigative project that has now continued for nearly 2 years, led to the arrest and sentencing of Larry Nassar, the former doctor for the national gymnastics team who was accused of molesting Olympic athletes and more than 100 other girls under the guise of medical treatment. He was sentenced to 40 to 175 years in prison. Just took a chance, put a reporter on a plane, brought back 1,000 pages of documents. It is just, again, I'm biased because I'm back in the business again, but it's just crucial, is it not, Jim, that we still have that kind of reporting and organizations that can do that in this country.
The sad part is, for a number of those newspapers, they're not necessarily going to have the funding to do that on a consistent basis. To do that kind of work,
yeah. But Larry Nassar would probably still be out there without the Indianapolis Star.
The one thing
still be molesting children without the Indianapolis Star.
The one thing that we know every day is that there are heinous crimes being committed. There's all kinds of malfeasance taking place, and that's why investigative journalism is so important. But it's so expensive to have any kind of investigative unit. It's challenging unless you have the resources of the Indianapolis Star for a lot of that ever to come to light.
And the resources of the Indianapolis Star and every other newspaper in the country is not what it was 10 years ago. Mike, are we going to hit bottom there when people are going to finally realize that you have to pay for content? Because the advertisers aren't paying like they used to, so that's going to have to come out of subscribers.
Well, Paul, fortunately, my advertisers do pay.
Yeah.
MagnoliaReporter.com is definitely not a free publication.
Right.
It's free for people to read, but believe you me, it's not free.
It costs money for you. And you've got to eat, my friend.
But, I could just only echo what you said about the Indianapolis Star. Did they not win the Pulitzer for that? I think they were nominated.
Yeah.
And there's never been a time where we've needed good, solid investigative journalism in this country. But there's also never been a time when we seem to be less financially able to make that happen. And the situation is getting worse at newspapers and at many websites. And of course, part of the problem is, instead of having 3,000 daily newspapers in this country like we used to, we've got 1,500 and 5 zillion websites of various degrees of credibility and financial stability. It's if you see a news website out there, they ask you to pay money to support it, you need to think about doing it.
Amen.
Because they wouldn't be, believe you me, they would not be asking you directly for money if they could get the support from businesses or whatever. They're looking for that money for a reason.
Absolutely. And I would say the same thing from our standpoint. If the Democrat Gazette asks you to pay a little more for a subscription, it's worth it. It's worth it.
There's a reason
to have one of the last really strong statewide newspapers in America.
The other possibility, and I'm, while it doesn't seem to have affected content, is you'll get people like the Jeff Bezos buying the Washington Post and running it as a kind of vanity project, and I don't think that's healthy. I do pay money to read the Washington Post, or to be able to read the Washington Post. I don't read it as much as I should, but Janet reads it, so it's good. Do we want to be in a world where it's the Jeff Bezoses who are basically deciding what the rest of us read? And I think that's really unhealthy for democracy if that's where we end up.
Yeah, I agree. So we've talked for about an hour now on the state of journalism, the state of the news, how it affects our politics in America. So here we sit in April of 2018. Where are we and where do we go from here? I'll entertain some closing comments. And Jim, I'll start with you.
Well, before I give my closing comments, let's give Rex a round of applause.
Oh, thank you. Well, I'm happy to be here. South Arkansas will always be home to me, so I love being here.
Having given many presentations at academic conventions, the one thing I learned a long time ago was to suck up to the moderator whenever possible. So I do have a couple of closing comments. And I wanted to go back to preparation for a 1986 summit between President Reagan and then, ironically, head of the Soviet Union, Mikhail Gorbachev. President Reagan, in terms of preparation, wanted some Russian proverbs that he potentially could use in discussing items of interest with Gorbachev. And there's one that he selected that I think, in terms of what we're looking at right now with fake news, that I liked. If anyone teaches Russian who's in this classroom or who is watching on live stream, I apologize in advance. My second language was Spanish, not Russian. But he said, in terms of trust, he said, doviai no proviai. Trust, but verify. And I think when we're trying to discern real from fake news, it's always important to assume nothing and try to use multiple sources for verification. And I also wanted to say one more thing. In 1995, roughly about this time of year, Carl Bernstein of the Washington Post team of Woodward and Bernstein was a special guest speaker at Southern Arkansas University in Hardin Theater. President Stephen Gamble introduced him. He gave a lecture on journalism, and to this day, he gives the same definition of journalism. He calls it, quote, the best available version of the truth. And I think with all of us, we can never be satisfied with just one story. As I said at the outset, it's important to look at various sources. And as Paul said correctly, get out of your comfort zone. Look at something that may not necessarily be normally in your wheelhouse. Whether you're a conservative, whether you're a liberal, whether you are the raging moderate, I think it's important to look at multiple sources, because that's going to give you a broader depth of knowledge and a greater depth of understanding to any type of comprehension of the news. And I did want to end with a shameless plug. If any of you ever want to see what our students at Southern Arkansas University are doing in the mass media program, it's very simple. Google my name and you'll come across my website. You'll see all of the syllabi. You'll see all of the projects that students produce, which are media presentations, position papers, links to multimedia blogs, because I always vowed from the outset, when we started the mass media program, I wanted to strongly believe in the concepts of transparency and accountability. And it also helps students as they go toward graduation, because then prospective employers or graduate school applications are certainly going to be enhanced by seeing all of the work that they do. And also, one more thing. When you're at my website, if you want to look at my social media links, you can follow me on Twitter, you can send me a friend request on Facebook, a connection request on LinkedIn, and I also have a new YouTube channel. Before we had mass media, we had emphases in the mass communication major of broadcast journalism and print journalism. There's more than 20 plus years worth of projects, because I save everything. I do it digitally, and I would do it in analog fashion. So it is an inexact video history of SAU, but I wanted to get that in. But I also wanted to, again, thank Rex for being our moderator this evening, and going back to what we've talked about before, with an informed citizenry being the bulwark of a democracy, that's something that just cannot be overstated. So I encourage all of you always to read, and occasionally watch cable if you want to be amused, but we appreciate the opportunity for you being here tonight and listening to our panel discussion.
Thank you. Paul, some
Okay.
final comments.
I'm not going to suck up to the moderator, I think.
You don't
I think I did well enough for all of us.
Yeah. So,
Just remember, I do have 3 columns a week in the largest newspaper in the state. I can write about you.
here's a hot take. I just said not to make hot takes, but I have a hot take. The internet's a fad, and it's going to go away. Now, that's a terrible take because it's probably not true, although I find myself sometimes thinking that it's become a lot less useful. When the technology first emerged, people thought that it had all kinds of fantastic democratic potential. It would become a conversation. It would enable conversations between people and politicians directly. It would allow people to comment on news stories they saw, and all of that turned out to be terrible.
True.
It's sad, yeah, sad but true. But the technology continues to evolve. And so what we say here today, we can probably come back in 5 or 10 years and we'll be embarrassed by some of the things we said because we've turned out to be so horribly, horribly wrong. And I've made a career out of telling my students now that the students will sometimes ask me to predict what might happen in the near or short term or sometimes distant future, and consistently I'm wrong about these things. But I think I'm right about the technology continuing to change and change the way our democracy works. And it may not be all bad. How the technology is neutral. It depends on how we use it. And if we can think about its positive potential and the potential it has to enhance democracy, that may mean that my quip about the internet being a fad, the internet's going to go away, we're not going to want to be on the internet anymore, is just as dumb as any other prediction that I've made that turned out to be incorrect.
Mike?
Paul, I agree again with a lot of what you said. Yeah, I kind of think the internet is a fad, and I'll go into that. You know, we don't know where news media is going. You know, if you told me 30 years ago or 40 years ago when I started my career what the internet, if you described then to me what the internet was going to be, you know, I would have naturally thought of it as being science fiction. Oh my gosh, you know, we newspaper people are going to be able to put videos, you know, on a TV screen and people could see them and we could chat back and forth with people like that. That would have been just incredible. But we don't know where media is going. One thing I do know, and that's an interesting thing about communication, is humanity hasn't thrown away a method of communication yet. We still use stone tablets. You know, look at a tombstone. We still use papyrus in one form or another. You know, we don't throw away any communication form. We just keep improving the existing forms and creating new ones. The process of innovation isn't going to stop, as Paul said. It is important to continue to support your local media, no matter what it is or what shape it takes. We've got radio, we've got cable, we've got an online news site, we've got a newspaper. We have all of these things, and they are going to continue in some form or another. I can't tell you what that form is going to be. I'm sure they're all going to change somewhat, but they're still going to be there, and they still are going to need your support. There's still going to be a need for a mass local media, because it is mass and not 100 different Facebook pages or websites that you're going to have to look through to find out the one thing you want to know about Magnolia at that moment. This is going to mean that our local news sites are going to have new models for revenue that go beyond the traditional advertising that you see on a website. Subscriptions, paywalls or voluntary payments, product placement, advertorials, special event sponsorships, subscriptions to newsletters that have advertising. All of these are going to be coming at you from local media, if they're not already. And if you want the kind of journalism that we've been talking a little bit about tonight, you're going to have to be willing to support it. You're going to have to be willing to pay for it. Because trust me, if you don't, the problem will just go away.
Thanks, Mike. Now I'll suck up to the panelists. Let's give them a hand. They did a great job tonight. I've got a request. There's a very quick evaluation form. If you would fill that out, and you can either get it to me or wave your hand, Paul Austin, out there. I'm blinded by the light. Yeah, get it to Paul in the back of the room. We need those from you. I want to close with this. I do want to close with this. I said earlier about the DARA lecture that I gave earlier this year in Little Rock, and I said, number one, it's not us, it's you, meaning you as news consumers have some responsibility too. But you might remember I said, number two, chill out. So some advice to close for the modern news consumer. Number one, try turning off cable news from time to time and reading a good book. You might be amazed at how entertaining it is. Number two, try turning off the television in the morning and reading a print newspaper or two before you leave the house with your morning coffee. Number three, try putting your phone away entirely. Pour yourself a cup of hot tea or something stronger if you wish, and listen to some classical music or some jazz. And number four, in an era when everybody seems to get worked up over national politics, why don't you forget about the national scene occasionally and get involved where you can have a difference? And that's in your local community. The school board, the city council, the quorum court. That's where the action really is in American democracy. The action is local, and it's why I write about Arkansas and only Arkansas in my column. So on behalf of all of us, thank you for being with us. Thank you again to Southern Arkansas University for hosting tonight's event. We'll be happy to visit with you afterwards, but that concludes the formal presentation. Thank you again. Outstanding. That was fun, actually. Went really fast.
Yeah, it did.
15, yeah.